My name is Charlotte Whitmore, and this is the story when my father on my wedding day stood up, called me a bastard, and walked out like I was nothing. But what he didn't realize was that I had the power to end everything he had built. The very next morning, I stepped into a place he thought he controlled, only to turn his world upside down forever. I wish I could tell you that my life began with laughter, warmth, and the kind of love that wraps itself around a child like a blanket on a cold night. But the truth is, my life began in whispers. Whispers of shame, whispers of scandal, whispers of a man who despised me from the very moment I was born. You see, I was the mistake my father never forgave. My mother was his secret, his forbidden love, and when she died while I was still a little girl, there was nothing left to shield me from his contempt. He married another woman soon after, built a new family, and pretended I was nothing more than an inconvenient reminder of a weakness he wanted to erase. For years, I told myself I didn't care. I told myself his silence at birthdays, his absence at school events, his constant dismissal of my existence didn't matter. But deep down, it cut me. Every rejection, every cold stare carved into me until I began to believe the lie he repeated without words, that I was unwanted, and then came the day that lie became a weapon. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, my wedding. I had found love in Alexander Hale, a man who saw strength in me when I saw only scars. The room glittered with lights, the air thick with perfume, the whispers of society elites filling every corner. For once, I thought maybe my father would simply sit quietly, swallow his pride, and let me have my moment. I was wrong. As the vows began, he stood. The music halted. All eyes turned to him. And then, in a voice sharp enough to slice through the silence, he shouted, "You're nothing but a bastard! You will never carry my name." The room gasped. I felt the world tilt beneath me, my heart pounding so hard, I thought it might break free of my chest. Guests whispered behind gloved hands, their faces a mixture of shock, pity, and judgment. He didn't just disown me that day. He annihilated me in front of everyone who mattered. But here's what my father didn't know. But before I tell you how I destroyed him, you need to know why he hated me enough to break me on my wedding day. Some wounds don't bleed on the outside. They carve themselves slowly, silently, shaping who you become long before you realize it. My childhood was built on those wounds. Dinner at the Whitmore house was never a meal. It was a performance. My father sat at the head of the table like a king, his presence filling the room even when his words didn't. Most nights, he didn't bother speaking to me at all. He'd address Daniel, my half-brother, with pride swelling in his voice, praising his grades, his athletic achievements, his promise to carry on the Whitmore name. Then, with the same breath, he'd glance at me and sneer, "You should learn from him, Charlotte." Every word was a reminder that I was less wanted, less worthy, less his. It didn't matter that I studied harder than Daniel, or that my teachers admired my quick mind. It didn't matter that I tried to earn his attention by excelling in everything I touched. To him, I was invisible, until he wanted to remind me I was a mistake. At night, when the house grew quiet, I would curl up in bed and cry into my pillow, muffling the sound so no one could hear. My stepmother, Margaret, would never have comforted me. She barely looked at me unless it was to remind me that I didn't belong under her roof. And Daniel, he thrived on my father's approval too much to notice the cracks in me. The only voice I had left was my own. And in the darkness, I would whisper promises to myself. One day I'll be more than this. One day I'll rise above him. One day, he'll regret the way he looked at me. I clung to those words like lifelines. When Amelia, my younger half-sister, was born, I thought maybe things would change. For a short time, my father softened. He doted on her, spoiled her, even smiled in her presence. But all it did was deepen the chasm between us. He could love. He just chose not to love me. I learned early that silence was its own form of cruelty. The silence at the dinner table when he ignored my voice. The silence in the car rides when he spoke only to Daniel. The silence in the house after Margaret's sharp glances reminded me I was little more than a guest overstaying her welcome. That silence taught me something important. Words weren't the only way to hurt someone. Absence could be louder than insults. Coldness could be sharper than knives. And so I grew up not as a daughter, but as an outsider, standing in the shadows of a man who would never see me as his own. Yet those shadows did something he never intended. They made me strong, because when you live your life unseen, you learn how to watch, how to listen, how to wait. I didn't know then that one day His cruelty would become my weapon. If my childhood was a cage, Alexander Hale was the first person who made me feel like the door could open. I met him at a charity gala hosted by his mother, Eleanor Hale, a woman with enough grace and steel to silence a room without saying a word. I remember standing near the edge of the ballroom, clutching a glass I hadn't touched, wishing I could disappear. And then, there he was, Alexander. He wasn't like the men I grew up watching, the ones who measured worth in wealth and bloodlines. He asked me questions no one ever cared to ask. What are you passionate about? What do you dream of? His eyes didn't look past me. They saw me. That night, for the first time, I felt like more than Richard Whitmore's shameful secret. The Hale family was everything mine wasn't. Eleanor and Charles Hale, Alexander's parents, treated me not as an interloper but as someone worth listening to. They built their empire on innovation and loyalty, not cruelty. Family dinners with them were warm, filled with laughter and stories. I found myself leaning into their world like it was a place I had always belonged. And Alexander, he didn't just love me, he believed in me. He told me I was brilliant, strong, and worthy. I'd never heard those words before, not from anyone who mattered. Slowly, I began to believe them too, but my father, of course, saw it differently. When word of our relationship reached him, Richard Whitmore's face twisted with a fury I'll never forget. "You think this boy actually loves you?" he spat one night when he cornered me in his office. "Don't delude yourself, Charlotte. You're nothing but an opportunist. You're clinging to him because of what his family has. Admit it." I didn't answer him then. There was no point. He had already decided who I was. Still, his words lodged deep in my chest. Part of me wondered if he was right. Did Alexander's world offer me a safety I craved, a power I secretly longed for? Or was it simply love? Maybe it was both. But unlike my father, Alexander never made me choose between being loved and being respected. He gave me both, freely. Every smile, every kiss, every late-night conversation where he held my hand and told me I was enough. It stitched together the pieces of me my father had torn apart. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving, I was living. Of course, Richard couldn't see that. He couldn't imagine that I was capable of inspiring love. To him, my relationship with Alexander was nothing more than a transaction, a strategic climb up a ladder I had no business touching. He thought marrying Alexander was my way of clawing into power. He was half right. The Hale estate in New York had never looked more magnificent. A cathedral dome of flowers arched over the aisle, strings of violins hummed through the air, and the city's most powerful people filled the seats like a sea of jewels and tailored suits. Every detail had been arranged with precision, the kind of ceremony whispered about in magazines, photographed for covers. It was the beginning of the life I had always dreamed of. Except for him. Richard Whitmore sat in the second row, rigid as stone, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might break. He hadn't spoken a word to me since Alexander proposed. He hadn't even congratulated me when the engagement was announced. Yet he came, not out of love, but because absence would have been more scandalous. My father would never risk whispers that suggested weakness. The ceremony began. Alexander looked breathtaking in his tailored suit, his eyes shining with that steady love that had carried me through storms. When I took his hand at the altar, I felt safe, strong, even free. For a moment, I let myself believe the past was behind me. The priest's words floated through the room. "Do you, Charlotte Whitmore, take Alexander Hale?" That's when it happened. The scrape of a chair broke the silence, sharp and jarring. My father rose to his feet. His voice cut through the cathedral like a blade. "She's a bastard!" Gasps erupted around us. Every head turned. His face burned crimson, veins bulging as he pointed a trembling hand at me. "She will never carry my name. Never. Do you hear me? She's nothing!" The violin stuttered to a stop. Eleanor Hale's lips parted in shock. Alexander's grip on my hand tightened, and the crowd's murmurs swelled like waves. Cameras flashed, recording not my vows, but my humiliation. For a second, I couldn't breathe. My chest felt hollow, my heart pounding against ribs that suddenly felt too fragile to hold it in. I had imagined this day for years, dreamed of walking down that aisle with pride, leaving the pain of my childhood behind. Instead, my father dragged it into the spotlight, branding me with shame in front of the very world I longed to rise above. But I did not cry. I lifted my chin. I met his eyes. If he wanted me broken, he would not have the satisfaction. My heart might have been in pieces, but no one in that room would see me crumble. Continue, I whispered to the priest, my voice steady despite the fire burning inside me, and so I said my vows, with my father's venom still ringing in my ears. I kissed Alexander, forcing myself to focus on the warmth of his hand and the certainty in his eyes. But inside, I was already changing, because in that moment, I swore this story would not end with my shame. What he didn't know was that by morning, I would be holding his future in my hands. The wedding was supposed to be a fairy tale, but his outburst twisted it into something else entirely. When the ceremony ended, the whispers began. Guests clustered in corners, their jeweled gowns and polished shoes whispering against marble floors as they leaned toward one another, heads bent like vultures circling over a fresh kill. My father's words, "She's a bastard," echoed through the room, repeated in hushed tones, their pitying eyes following me wherever I turned. Some people avoided me altogether, as if shame were contagious. Others offered tight, polite smiles that only deepened my humiliation. And then there were the looks of pity, the ones I hated most. To them, I was a tragic bride. To me, I was already a storm. Alexander tried to shield me. He kept his hand on mine, introduced me proudly to every guest as his wife, his partner, his equal. Eleanor whispered assurances, promising that people would forget my father's cruelty. But I knew better. People never forget blood. Still, I smiled. I lifted my chin, posed for photographs, danced when the music played. To the world, I was the unbroken bride. But inside, my father's voice wasn't an echo. It was fuel. That night, when the last guest left and the champagne glasses were empty, I stood before the mirror in my bridal suite. The gown was still flawless, the jewels still glittering, but I saw none of it. What I saw was him. Richard Whitmore, standing in the middle of that cathedral, stripping me of dignity in front of hundreds. My chest rose and fell slowly, rage pumping through me like a second heartbeat. I thought of the years he'd spent silencing me, erasing me, branding me as less. And tonight, he had tried to finish the job once and for all, but something inside me hardened. I would not cry. I would not collapse. Not anymore, because if he wanted to break me, he'd miscalculated. I pressed my hands flat against the vanity, staring into my own eyes until they burned. For the first time in my life, I didn't see the girl who cowered in the shadows of Richard Whitmore. I saw a woman, one who had endured, one who had learned how to wait, one who had everything he never expected me to have. Power. In that silence, I made a promise to myself. I vowed that the humiliation he gave me on my wedding day would be the last time he ever held the upper hand. I vowed that every word, every look, every dismissal would be repaid, not with tears, not with pleas, but with something sharp enough to cut through his empire. I went to bed that night not as a broken daughter, but as a woman ready to destroy. Morning light spilled through the floor-to-ceiling windows of Alexander's penthouse, painting the city gold. For a moment, I just lay there staring at the ceiling, feeling the stillness. My wedding gown was gone, replaced by silk pajamas Eleanor had quietly slipped into the room the night before. The world outside was moving forward, but inside me, something was suspended, caught between the wreckage of yesterday and the fire of what I knew had to come next. Alexander stirred beside me, his arm draped protectively over my waist. He kissed my temple softly. "You don't have to think about him," he whispered. "Not today. Not ever again." I wanted to believe him. I wanted to let his warmth erase the memory of my father standing in front of hundreds of guests, tearing my name apart like it was something rotten. But my father's voice still rang in my ears, sharp and unforgiving. I turned to face Alexander, placing my hand against his chest. His heartbeat steady and calm, everything mine wasn't. "This isn't about my pain," I said quietly. "It's about my revenge." He frowned, brushing a strand of hair from my face. "Charlotte, you don't need to fight him. You've already won. You're free of him now. You're my wife. That's all that matters." But he didn't understand. My father hadn't just hurt me in that cathedral. He had built my entire life on silence, on cruelty, on shame. If I walked away now, then his last word about me, that I was nothing, would stand. And I refused to let that be my legacy. "I can't let him walk away from this," I told Alexander, my voice firm. "Not after everything. Last night was the end of something, but today is the beginning of mine." He studied me for a long moment, the weight of his gaze heavy. Finally he sighed, half in resignation, half in admiration. "You really are unstoppable, aren't you?" I smiled faintly, though it didn't reach my eyes. No, I'm inevitable. I rose from the bed, pulling on a robe, and walked toward the window. The skyline stretched endlessly before me, a reminder that this city didn't belong to kings like Richard Whitmore anymore. It belonged to those who knew how to wield power, those who could take what was theirs without apology. And I would, somewhere in the glass towers glittering beneath the morning sun. My father was already planning how to spin last night, how to bury the whispers, how to regain control of the story. He thought he had humiliated me. He thought he still held the reins. He had no idea. Because while Richard Whitmore was trying to salvage his reputation, I was preparing to take something far greater, and revenge was waiting for me at Hale Industries. The glass towers of Hale Industries gleamed in the morning sun, a fortress of steel and ambition rising over the city. I had been here before, but never like this. Never as someone who belonged. Alexander walked beside me, his hand resting lightly at my back as we entered the marble lobby. Executives in sharp suits turned as we passed, their polite smiles laced with curiosity. They'd all heard by now. My father's public outburst had spread faster than wildfire. No one in this building would ever look at Richard Whitmore the same way again. The elevator ride felt endless. My reflection in the mirrored walls looked calm, poised, every hair in place. But beneath it, my heart pounded. I thought of last night's vow, of the shame burned into me at the altar. And I reminded myself, today was the beginning of my revenge. When the doors opened, the boardroom was already full. Dozens of eyes turned toward us as Alexander led me to the head of the long mahogany table. The air buzzed with restrained whispers, the kind that carried both scandal and expectation. "Good morning," Alexander began, his voice steady and commanding. "I know there are concerns after last night's unfortunate events. But let me be clear, Hale Industries stands united. And I want to introduce someone who will ensure that unity continues." He gestured toward me. "Charlotte Whitmore, my wife, will be joining this board, effective immediately. She will have full decision-making authority in matters concerning this company's operations." The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. A few brows rose. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats. But no one dared object outright. Alexander Hale's word in this room was law. And now, by his side, so was mine. I stood, letting my gaze sweep across the room. Some met my eyes with cautious respect, others with thinly veiled skepticism. But I didn't care. I hadn't fought my way out of my father's shadow to beg for acceptance. "Thank you," I said, my voice clear, unshaken. "I'm aware that some of you may have doubts. But you'll soon see I'm not here to decorate this table. I'm here to lead, and to protect Hale Industries from anyone who threatens it, even if that person happens to share my blood." A ripple of unease passed through the room at that last line. Perfect. Let them whisper. Let the message sink in. Because Richard Whitmore's days were numbered, and deep down, they all knew it. As the meeting moved forward, I sat back in my chair, the leather cool against my palms, and felt the weight of power settling onto my shoulders. This wasn't just Alexander's empire anymore. It was ours. And by extension, it was mine. Richard thought he was irreplaceable. He was about to learn how disposable he truly was. The summons went out that morning, formal and impersonal. "Richard Whitmore, Executive Review, 10 a.m. Hale Industries headquarters." I made sure it came from my office. By the time the clock struck 10, I was already seated behind the sleek oak desk Alexander had insisted I use. The city skyline stretched endlessly behind me, a view that once would have belonged only to men like my father. Today, it was mine. The door opened without a knock. He entered as if he still owned the room. Richard Whitmore, polished as ever in his navy suit, shoulders squared, stride deliberate. But beneath the tailored fabric, I saw the cracks, the desperate attempt to cling to control after the disaster of my wedding day. "Charlotte," he said smoothly, as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't stood before hundreds of people and spat venom into my vows. "I assume you've finally come to your senses. This little stunt, marrying into the Hales, playing boardroom queen, it doesn't suit you. But if you're ready to apologize, I might still be willing to forgive." His arrogance was almost laughable. He truly believed I had called him here to beg for his approval, to mend the image he'd shattered. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands in front of me. "I didn't ask you here for forgiveness," I said evenly. "I asked you here for closure." His brow furrowed, confusion flickering for just a moment before the smugness returned. "Closure? Charlotte, don't be dramatic. You're my daughter, whether you like it or not. You can't erase blood, no. I agreed, sliding open the folder on my desk. But I can erase you. I pushed the papers across the polished surface. Termination documents. Every word legal, binding, and final. His smile faltered as he scanned the pages. This is a joke, he scoffed, but his voice was thinner now. You don't have the authority. I do, I said, my voice steady as stone. As a member of the board, as Alexander's wife, and as the one person who will never again allow you to decide my worth. He slammed the papers down, his hands trembling. You ungrateful little... Don't, I cut him off sharply, rising to my feet. You had your chance to be my father. You chose humiliation instead. Now I choose this. The silence stretched between us, heavy and suffocating. For the first time, the man who had loomed over my childhood, who had dictated every moment of shame I endured, was powerless, and I reveled in it, because in that instant, I saw something I had never witnessed before in Richard Whitmore. Hesitation, doubt. For the first time in my life, I watched my father's pride crumble. Richard's face turned scarlet as he shoved the termination papers back across the desk. His composure shattered, revealing the man beneath the polished armor. "This company needs me," he barked, his voice thundering against the glass walls of my office. I built its foundation with my blood and sweat. These people trust me. They need me. Without me, Hale Industries will collapse. I let him rage, my eyes never leaving his. He looked so certain, so desperate to cling to the illusion of his indispensability. Once, I might have believed him. Once, I might have trembled at his anger, convinced that he held all the power, but not anymore. "Really?" I said quietly, sliding another folder toward him. "Because from where I sit, it looks like you've been bleeding this company dry." His hands stilled. Slowly, he opened the folder, eyes darting across the pages. Financial reports. Hidden accounts. Misappropriated funds shuffled into shell companies, traced back to him. I'd spent nights with Alexander and Hale Industries' legal team unearthing every shred of evidence. "You've been sloppy," I said. Cutting corners. Skimming profits. Making deals under the table with suppliers we should never have touched. Do you think no one would notice? Or did you think you were untouchable? He slammed the folder shut, his jaw clenched. This is fabricated lies. You don't understand how this business works. I understand enough to know that if the board sees this, your career won't just end, it will burn. My voice was calm, controlled the way his never was when he felt cornered. So don't tell me this company needs you. It doesn't. It never did. His eyes narrowed into slits. Careful, Charlotte. You may think you've won, but I know things. Secrets about you, about where you came from. Do you really want the world to know the truth? For a heartbeat, the old fear stirred in me. The fear of being the bastard he had named me before everyone I loved. I remembered the shame of whispers in school, the pitying looks of neighbors, the endless silence at his table. But then the fear passed, because I had spent years preparing myself for this very threat. You think secrets can save you? I asked, leaning forward, my voice low but sharp enough to cut through his bravado. You think you can scare me back into silence with the same story you've held over my head since I was a child? He smirked, mistaking my calm for doubt. Exactly. You can't risk it? You've built this shiny new life with Alexander? What happens when people find out you were nothing but... I raised a hand, stopping him cold. My heart no longer raced. My voice no longer trembled. He thought secrets could save him. He had no idea I already knew. The pen felt heavier than it should have. My fingers hovered above the paper, the final line of his termination letter staring up at me like a silent dare. For 29 years, Richard Whitmore had defined me with his cruelty, his silence, his contempt. With one signature, I would define him. He sat across from me, his jaw tight. His fists balled against the edge of my desk. For all his bluster, his eyes betrayed him. There was panic there, raw and unfiltered. "You won't do it," he growled, though the edge in his voice was dulled now. "You're my daughter. You can't fire your own father." I looked at him. This man who had reduced me to shadows, who had broken me on my wedding day with a single word. And for the first time, I felt nothing but clarity. "You're wrong," I whispered. And then I pressed the pen to the page and signed my name. Silence fell like a shroud over the room. He stared at the paper as though it were a death sentence. In a way, it was. The door opened, and 2 members of Hale Industries security stepped inside. I had ordered them to wait. They didn't hesitate. "Mr. Whitmore," one said firmly, "you'll need to come with us." Richard's face twisted. This is ridiculous. I built this company. You can't. But they didn't wait for his permission. They flanked him, their presence an undeniable reminder that he no longer had authority here. The man who had commanded rooms with his voice, who had silenced me with a look, was now being escorted out like a common intruder. As he was led to the door, his eyes met mine one last time. There was no fury in them now, only something far worse. Defeat. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply held his gaze until the door closed behind him. Outside, the office floor had fallen into a hush. Employees peeked over cubicles and glanced up from their screens as security walked him past. Some gasped. Others whispered. All of them saw the truth. Richard Whitmore was no longer untouchable. I remained in my office, standing at the window, watching as the reflection of the lobby shimmered faintly in the glass. He humiliated me in public, I murmured to myself. Now he's the one who leaves in disgrace before the world. The weight of it pressed into me, not guilt, but gravity. This was more than revenge. It was justice. Yet, even as the fire in me quieted for a moment, I knew this wasn't the end. Because firing him, as satisfying as it was, didn't erase the years of cruelty. It didn't silence the whispers of the past or undo the scars he left behind. No, this was just the opening move, but firing him was only the beginning. By the next morning, Richard's downfall wasn't just office gossip, it was headline news. Whitmore executive fired by his own. Daughter-in-law. Wedding. Humiliation followed by corporate betrayal. Family. Scandal rocks Hale Industries. The tabloids couldn't get enough of it. Neither could the financial papers. Everyone loved a scandal, and this one was dripping with irony. A man who built his name on power had been undone by the very daughter he once disowned. I scrolled through the articles in silence, each one a dagger to his reputation. They replayed the wedding incident, quoted anonymous guests, and speculated about his future, or rather, the lack of it. To the world, Richard Whitmore was no longer a titan. He was a cautionary tale, and I knew that for a man like him, social ruin was even worse than financial loss. By the afternoon, the fallout had begun. His so-called friends, those country club allies and boardroom drinking companions, stopped answering his calls. His inbox was flooded, but not with offers of support. Instead, polite rejections and regrettable circumstances piled up like bricks in a wall. Closing around him, the man who had once held court at Elite. Dinners was now whispered about over. Champagne flutes. But the real theater unfolded at home. Stepmother Eleanor was livid. How could she? She hissed at Richard in their kitchen, her voice dripping with venom. Firing you like some disposable employee? She's ruined us all. Richard slammed his fist against the counter. She hasn't ruined me. She humiliated herself. This won't last. Daniel, my half-brother, joined in, his face red with fury. You should have seen her at the office, Eleanor. She looked proud, like she's finally queen of the empire. Everything we worked for, everything I worked for, she just snatched it away. Everything you worked for? Eleanor shot back, bitterness sharp in her voice. Daniel, you never worked for anything. Your father gave you everything. And look how that turned out. Their bickering filled the house, but in the corner, Amelia stayed quiet. My half-sister had always been the shadow in the family. Quieter, more observant. She glanced at Richard with something I didn't expect. Not pity, not anger, but a spark of recognition. Later, I would hear from a distant cousin that Amelia had whispered, almost to herself. At least she had the courage to do what we all wanted. That, more than any headline, told me the tide was shifting. Not everyone in Richard's orbit despised me. Some were quietly rooting for me. Still, I wasn't naive. Richard was many things. Cruel, arrogant, proud. But he wasn't a man who would crumble without a fight. His silence in the media wasn't surrender. It was calculation. I could almost feel it in the air, like a storm waiting at the horizon. Because for all the whispers of his ruin, one truth remained. Richard wasn't finished. Not yet. For a few days, it seemed like Richard had vanished. No calls, no statements, no desperate attempts to salvage his career. The media fed on scraps of speculation, but there was no fresh scandal, no counter-strike. And then suddenly, there was. The morning paper carried my name across the front page, not as Charlotte Whitmore Hale, board member of Hale Industries, but as the bastard bride. The article dripped with venom. It claimed my birth was illegitimate, that my mother had been nothing but a fleeting affair in Richard Whitmore's life. It suggested that my marriage to Alexander was nothing more than a desperate attempt to claw my way into wealth and status. It was his voice behind every line. I could hear it in the phrasing, the cruelty, the way the writer painted me as both pathetic and manipulative. Richard had gone to the press, and he had gone for blood. By noon, gossip sites had picked up the story. Comment sections brimmed with strangers dissecting my life. Gold digger. No wonder her father disowned her. Smart girl. Marrying into billions fixes everything. Each word was like acid poured on old wounds. I shut my laptop and paced the length of Alexander's study, my chest tight, my hands trembling. It wasn't the humiliation that broke me. It was the familiarity. This was exactly how Richard wanted me to feel. Small, ashamed, voiceless. For a moment, I faltered. What if the world believed him? What if all they saw was the bastard he'd named me at my wedding? Charlotte. Alexander's voice cut through my spiraling thoughts. He stood in the doorway, calm, steady, his presence grounding me. He crossed the room, took my shaking hands in his, and said quietly, "Do you honestly think I care what they write?" Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes. "It's not just about you caring. It's about the world, the board, the shareholders. They know who you are," he said firmly. "And more importantly, I know who you are. You didn't trap me. You didn't marry me for money. You married me because you're strong enough to stand by me. And I married you because I wanted you by my side. Richard can't rewrite that." His words steadied me more than I wanted to admit. For years, I'd been alone in every battle. But now, for the first time, I had someone who refused to let me crumble. I exhaled slowly, the fire returning to my veins. Richard thought a few headlines could undo me, but he underestimated the strength he had forged in me through every cruelty, every humiliation. If he wanted a war, then a war he would have. And this time, I wasn't the little girl crying in the shadows of his house. I was Charlotte Whitmore Hale, and I was ready to burn everything he cared about to the ground. If my father wanted a war, I'd give him one. Richard thought he could destroy me with gossip. He underestimated how much damage I could do with the truth. For weeks, I had quietly gathered information, board reports, financial records, whispers from loyal executives who had long despised his arrogance. Richard Whitmore had always considered himself untouchable, a man too valuable to the company's legacy to ever be questioned. But I knew better. His ego had left fingerprints on every shady deal he thought he'd buried. The files arrived on my desk in a sleek black folder, delivered by the head of compliance himself. "You'll want to see this," he'd said grimly. And I did. Inside were contracts signed under shell companies, sweetheart deals that funneled money into his private accounts, and records of vendors who had been strong-armed into agreements benefiting no one but Richard. It wasn't just questionable. It was damning. At the next board meeting, I sat across from men and women who had once sung Richard's praises. The weight of the evidence lay between us, and I let them read in silence. Their expressions shifted from curiosity to horror, then to something that almost looked like fear. Finally, one of the senior members cleared his throat. "If this ever goes public—" "It won't," I said smoothly. "Not if we act decisively." There was no hesitation after that. By unanimous vote, the board stripped Richard of his remaining pensions, liquidated his company stocks, and rescinded every privilege tied to his name. What little fortune he had outside of Hale Industries couldn't cover the debts he had secretly amassed. I should have felt relief. Instead, I felt something darker. Power. When the board secretary read the decision aloud, I imagined Richard's face when he realized the empire he had leaned on for decades had turned its back on him. I could almost hear his rage, the denial, the sputtering insistence that this was all temporary. But it wasn't temporary. It was final. Alexander squeezed my hand under the table, a silent reminder that I wasn't alone in this battle. Yet I couldn't look away from the vision of my father's world collapsing brick by brick, all because of the daughter he once called a mistake. The irony was poetic. His downfall hadn't come from rivals, hostile takeovers, or economic downturns. It had come from within, from the very blood he had despised. That night, reports confirmed what I already knew. Richard's accounts were frozen. His properties, tied up in fraudulent loans, were under investigation. His so-called allies had gone silent. In one stroke, he had gone from respected executive to a man stripped bare of wealth and influence. He was penniless. For the first time in his life, Richard Whitmore had nothing. Nothing. Except his bitterness. It was late when the pounding started. Heavy, uneven fists striking against the front door of the Hale penthouse. Alexander had gone to a late meeting, and for a moment, I thought it might be security. But the sound wasn't professional, wasn't controlled. It was wild, desperate. When I opened the door, the sight nearly stopped me cold. Richard Whitmore stood there swaying, reeking of alcohol. His once pristine suit was rumpled, his tie loosened, his eyes bloodshot. The proud, polished titan who had spent his life looking down on me was gone. In his place was a broken man clawing for scraps of dignity. "Charlotte," he slurred, leaning against the doorframe, "we need to talk." I didn't move. "You shouldn't be here." "I had everything," he said, staggering past me into the foyer without invitation. "The company, the respect, the world at my feet, and you—" He jabbed a finger at me, his voice shaking with rage and despair. "You took it all, my own daughter." His voice cracked on the word, as though it burned his throat to say it. I closed the door, keeping my posture tall, calm. "I didn't take it, Richard. You handed it away piece by piece. I just made sure you couldn't bury the evidence." His face crumpled, and for a moment the fury melted into something pitiful. He dropped heavily onto the couch, burying his head in his hands. "I'm ruined, Charlotte. They won't answer my calls. Eleanor's threatening to leave. Daniel blames me. Amelia won't even look at me. You're all I have left." A bitter laugh escaped me. "All you have left? You made sure I had nothing. You made me the bastard, the shame, the mistake. And now, when the world turns on you, you come crawling to me?" His head shot up, eyes glistening. "Please, we can fix this. You're powerful now. You have influence. Just help me, Charlotte. I'll make it right. His words dissolved into a choked sob. For a flicker of a second, I almost felt it. The pull of blood, the instinct to forgive. But then I remembered the wedding. The sneer in his voice when he spat the word bastard in front of hundreds. The years of silence, the bruises on my heart he'd left with every rejection. I steadied my voice, cold and sharp as glass. "You made me your enemy the moment you made me your shame." Something inside him broke at that. His pleading turned to curses, his voice rising as he stumbled toward the door again. "Ungrateful, worthless, you'll always be nothing, Charlotte. Nothing." But his words no longer pierced. They bounced off me like pebbles against stone. When the door slammed behind him, the silence that followed was deafening. For the first time, it wasn't heavy. It was freeing. And in that moment, I realized I'd won. After that night, Richard Whitmore simply vanished. There were no more articles, no more whispers of defiance, no final attempts to claw his way back into the spotlight. His name, once spoken with awe in Manhattan's boardrooms and ballrooms, slipped quietly into silence. Within weeks, the same people who had once praised him couldn't even recall his last headline. The world had moved on, and Richard was nothing more than a ghost of scandal. It should have felt like victory. And in many ways, it did. The man who called me a bastard at my own wedding was now disgraced, forgotten, erased. He no longer sat in corner offices or presided over dinners where I was unwelcome. His kingdom of influence had collapsed into dust. For the first time in my life, the shadow of Richard Whitmore no longer stretched over me. Yet in the stillness that followed, I discovered something I hadn't expected. Revenge didn't roar with triumph. It whispered. It lingered. It tasted. Sweet on my tongue, but the sweetness carried a heaviness I hadn't anticipated. Like wine that burns your throat even as it warms your chest. I sat in my office one evening, the city glittering outside the glass walls, and wondered who I had become. The board respected me now. Alexander adored me. Even Amelia, timid and watchful, had reached out in secret, confessing she admired me for standing up to the man who had broken us both. On the surface, everything was perfect. But beneath it, something gnawed at me because I remembered Richard's face that night. Broken, desperate, begging. And for a fleeting second, I had felt the power in my hands like a blade. I had enjoyed it. That thought unsettled me more than his curses ever had. Alexander came in, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You're quiet tonight." "I was just thinking," I murmured, staring out at the city, "about what it means to win." He squeezed my shoulder, his voice steady. "It means you survived, and you built something stronger from the ashes." I nodded, but the unease remained. Because Richard had survived the same way for decades, by crushing those beneath him, by clawing his way up while others fell. And I couldn't help but wonder, had I taken him down, or had I simply become him in another form? The silence after the storm was supposed to bring peace, but instead, it left me with questions I wasn't sure I wanted to answer. Was I free, or was I becoming him? Revenge had burned like fire in my veins, but once the flames died down, I had to decide what would remain in the ashes. I couldn't live forever in the shadow of Richard Whitmore's downfall. If I did, then all I'd become was a mirror of him, defined by control, obsessed with power, consumed by bitterness. So I chose to build. At Hale Industries, I stopped being the scandalous bride who had humiliated her father and started being Charlotte Whitmore Hale, an executive who made decisions with precision and purpose. I studied late into the night, learning the company's intricacies, listening to people who had been ignored by men like Richard for decades. Slowly, respect shifted, not because of my marriage, but because of my work. The first board meeting where someone said, "Charlotte's proposal makes sense." Without glancing at Alexander, I felt a quiet triumph. Not the fiery satisfaction of revenge, but the steady strength of something real. Yet business wasn't enough. My mother's face haunted me. Her sacrifices, her silence, the way she had loved me even when Richard hadn't. She had deserved better. So in her name, I started something new, a foundation for women abandoned by the very men who were supposed to protect them. Scholarships, housing, legal aid, opportunities she never had but always would have wanted for me. Standing at the ribbon-cutting ceremony of the first shelter, I felt her with me. Not in shame, not in whispers, but in legacy. For once my story wasn't just about him. It was about her. About me. Still, shadows have a way of lingering. At every event, I caught flashes of Richard in the corners of my mind. His arrogance in the faces of other men who underestimated me. His cruelty in the whispers of those who doubted me. And sometimes, when I caught my own reflection in the glass walls of Hale's headquarters, I wondered if I carried his eyes. The same hunger, the same cold determination. Alexander reminded me I wasn't him. Amelia's quiet loyalty reminded me too. And yet, late at night, when the city outside glittered like 1,000 watchful eyes, I couldn't shake the feeling that Richard hadn't left me entirely. He was still there, in the way I wielded power, in the silence that followed my victories. I had taken everything from him, but in some twisted way, he had left something inside me too. I was building my own legacy, yes, but I carried his ghost in every step I climbed, and the higher I rose, the heavier that shadow seemed to grow. Because no matter how far I rose, I still carried his shadow. Family had always been a battlefield, but after Richard's fall, the lines were redrawn in ways none of us could ignore. Daniel made his stance clear from the very beginning. At a shareholders' dinner, he cornered me, his face red, his jaw tight. "You think you've won, don't you?" He spat under his breath. "You think sitting in Father's chair makes you worthy? You're nothing but a thief. You stole everything from him and from me." His words carried the same venom Richard once used. To Daniel, I wasn't a sister. I was the usurper who had toppled the throne he believed should have been his. "I didn't steal anything," I replied evenly. "I earned it." "You just expected it to be handed to you?" He scoffed, his eyes narrowing. "You'll never belong here. Not with this family. Not with this company." Daniel walked away before I could answer, but he didn't need to hear my response. His mind was made up. I wasn't his sister. I was his enemy. Amelia, however, was different. She came to me quietly, almost nervously, a week after the dinner. We met in a quiet cafe downtown, away from the constant swirl of eyes and ears. She stirred her coffee without looking at me, her fingers trembling slightly. I wanted to say, "I don't blame you," she whispered finally. I tilted my head, studying her. "For what?" "For Father. For everything." She lifted her eyes, and for the first time, I saw not the timid shadow of our childhood, but a spark of strength. He broke all of us in different ways. You were just the only one brave enough to fight back. Her words caught me off guard. Amelia had always been quiet, the kind of person who slipped out of the room before tempers flared. I had never expected her to stand with me. Amelia, I began, unsure of what to say. She reached across the table and placed her hand lightly on mine. Daniel hates you because you remind him of the truth he doesn't want to face. But I see it, Charlotte. I see who you are. And for the first time, I think maybe there's hope. Maybe we don't have to be broken forever. Something inside me shifted at her words. For years, I had thought of myself as an only child, cast out of the family that should have been mine. But in Amelia's quiet strength, I felt a thread of connection I hadn't known I craved. Leaving the cafe, I knew I hadn't repaired my family. Not entirely. Daniel's hatred burned too hot, his pride too thick. But Amelia's presence gave me something I hadn't felt in a long time. The possibility of healing. However fragile, blood ties may bind, but betrayal cuts deeper. Revenge has a way of consuming the air around you. Even after Richard was stripped of his power, even after his name became synonymous with disgrace, I felt him lurking in the corners of my mind. At night, when Alexander and I sat together in the silence of our home, I sometimes caught myself drifting, planning, remembering, analyzing every step of my father's downfall as if the war wasn't yet over. Alexander noticed. He always did. One evening, I sat in my study, papers spread before me. Not company documents this time, but old photographs. My mother's smile, Richard's proud stance, a younger version of me who still believed in fairy tales. My fingers lingered on one image until I heard the door creak. Still fighting ghosts? Alexander's voice was soft but laced with concern. I looked up. He leaned against the doorway, his tie loosened, the weight of his day still visible on his face. Yet his eyes were only on me. I don't know how to stop, I admitted, surprising myself with the honesty. Even now when he's nothing, I can't let go. It feels like if I stop, I'll lose the strength that carried me this far. He walked toward me, placing a hand on the desk beside the photos. Charlotte, you've already won. The strength isn't in clinging to the fight, it's in choosing what comes after it. I wanted to believe him, but fear twisted inside me. What if all I am is his daughter? What if revenge is the only thing keeping me from becoming him? Alexander's expression softened. He knelt in front of me, taking my hands in his. Listen to me. You're not defined by what he did to you. You're defined by what you did to him. The words struck something deep within me. His steady voice, his unwavering presence felt like an anchor pulling me back to shore. I blinked, realizing my hands trembled in his, and for once it wasn't from anger. It was from relief. I leaned forward, resting my forehead against his. And what if I lose myself anyway? Then I'll find you, he whispered. Every time. The silence that followed was heavy but warm, a silence that wrapped around us rather than divided us. I felt the tension in my chest loosen, the endless cycle of rage and planning finally quieting, if only for that moment. Later that night, as I lay beside him, I traced the shape of his hand against mine and wondered if maybe he was right. Maybe I wasn't just Richard's shadow, or his revenge. Maybe I could be more, because Alexander saw more, and for the first time, I believed him. The cemetery was quiet, as it always had been. A veil of morning mist curled around the iron gates, softening the sharpness of the world. I walked slowly down the narrow path, clutching a single white rose in my hand. My heels clicked against the stone, each step echoing in the silence until I stopped before the grave I had avoided for too many years. Hello, Mama. My voice cracked, surprising me. I hadn't spoken those words aloud in so long. Her name, engraved in weathered marble, stared back at me. Eleanor Whitmore, beloved mother. The words seemed too small to hold the vastness of her love. I knelt down, placing the rose at the base of the headstone, and brushed away the damp leaves that had gathered. I should have come sooner, I whispered. But you know why I stayed away? It hurt too much. Being here felt like admitting I was alone. The wind stirred gently as if listening. I closed my eyes, trying to summon her voice, her laugh, the way her hands always seemed to make everything safe. But all I could see was Richard's scowl, blotting out everything good. I need to tell you something, I continued, my words trembling but steadying with each syllable. He broke me, Mama. For years he made sure I never forgot that I wasn't enough. He called me names, ignored me, reminded me at every turn that I was the mistake he could never forgive. And then at my wedding, My throat tightened. He did it again. In front of everyone. He made sure the world knew I was his shame. I paused, biting my lip until I tasted iron. But I didn't let it end there. I told her everything. How I rose from that humiliation. How I stood in the boardroom with Alexander at my side. How I slid the papers across the desk and watched Richard's pride crack for the first time. I told her about the whispers in the press, about his disgrace, about how he left our world with nothing but bitterness clinging to him like smoke. I didn't just avenge myself, I said, my voice firmer now, steadier. I avenged you. The words hung in the air, heavier than I expected, but not suffocating. For once, they felt right. I did it for the nights you cried alone because of him, for the way he dismissed you as if you were less, even when you gave him everything. For every moment he made you feel small, and for every time I watched and couldn't protect you. I did it, Mama. He can't hurt us anymore. I let out a long breath and touched the cold stone with my fingertips, tracing the letters of her name as though it were her hand. For the first time in years, I felt something shift inside me, not triumph, not anger, but peace. And peace, I realized, was what I had been fighting for all along. They say revenge is hollow, that it fills you with nothing but ashes. Maybe that's true for some. But as I stand here, looking back on the wreckage of what I did, I don't feel empty. I feel alive. I feel powerful. For the first time in my life, I am not Richard Whitmore's bastard. I am Charlotte Whitmore, the woman who refused to be broken. I need to tell you something. Not as a daughter scarred by her father, not as a wife standing in the shadow of her husband's empire, but as a woman who clawed her way out of humiliation and into power. If you've ever been betrayed, you know the feeling. That hot sting in your chest when someone you love turns their back on you. That helplessness when the room watches you crumble, waiting for your shame to entertain them. That moment when you look at yourself and wonder if maybe they were right, that maybe you are nothing. That was me. At my wedding, standing in silk and lace, when my own father rose and called me a bastard in front of everyone. He walked out as though I didn't exist. And for a moment, I believed him, but only for a moment. Because the very next morning, I discovered something. Humiliation can be a weapon. Betrayal can be fuel. Pain can be transformed into something sharp enough to cut the very person who gave it to you. And that's what I did. I cut him down, stripped him of the pride he used like a blade against me, and left him with nothing but the silence he once forced on me as a child. Now, I'll ask you this. If you were in my place, what would you have done? Would you have forgiven the man who spat on your name, who dragged your mother's memory through the dirt, who made sure you grew up believing you didn't deserve to breathe the same air as him? Or would you have destroyed him piece by piece until the world saw him for what he truly was? Think about it. Because revenge is not always about hatred. It's about reclaiming the part of yourself that someone tried to steal. And here's where I turn to you. Tell me, what would you have done? Would you have walked away? Or would you have burned it all down like I did? Let me know in the comments below. And if my story has stirred something inside you, don't forget to like and subscribe. For stories like this deserve to be heard, and voices like ours deserve to rise. But before you decide, remember this. Revenge is power. Justice is not always handed to you. Sometimes you have to take it with your own hands. And as for me, my story isn't over. Not yet. The news came quietly, as such things often do. No headlines, no cameras, no whispers traveling through gilded ballrooms this time. Just a discreet email from one of Hale Industries' legal advisors. Richard Whitmore has officially declared bankruptcy. He has left New York. No known address. For a long moment, I simply stared at the words. My father, Richard Whitmore, the man who once walked into rooms like he owned the very air inside them, the man who believed money and power would immortalize him, was gone. Not dead, but worse. Erased. Bankrupt. Alone. Forgotten. I thought there might be a pang in me, some lingering shard of that little girl who once hoped he'd look at her and see more than a mistake. But there was nothing. Not even bitterness. Not even joy. Just a cool, steady silence in my chest. Maybe that was the truest revenge of all. Not the anger, not the fire, not the public disgrace, but this silence. The end of his presence in my mind. I imagined him wandering some small town, his expensive suit sold, his name carrying no weight beyond his own bitterness. No family left to follow him, no boardroom left to revere him, no audience to applaud him. Just a man with nothing but his ghosts. Alexander asked me later that night, "Do you feel sorry for him?" I looked out over the city skyline, the lights glittering like promises I had made to myself years ago. "No," I said simply. "He took my childhood. I took his pride. Balance, at last. The truth is, pity requires love, or at least a thread of connection. Richard cut that thread the moment he stood up at my wedding and called me a bastard in front of the world. Maybe even before that, when he looked at me as a child and saw not his daughter, but a stain on his name. Some people say forgiveness is freedom. For me, freedom came in watching him lose everything he worshipped: status, money, power, while I stood taller than he ever allowed me to be. I closed the email, deleted it, and never looked back. That night, as I lay beside Alexander, I realized something. Revenge isn't always fire and thunder. Sometimes it's a quiet ending, a door closing softly, a chapter that writes itself to completion without you having to lift another pen. Richard Whitmore was gone from my life. Not as a father, not as an enemy, but as nothing at all, and in that nothing, I found peace, Minnie Hook. He took my childhood, I took his pride. Balance, at last. There are moments that define you, not the ones you dream of, but the ones you never wanted. For me, that moment was when my father stood at my wedding, his voice sharp as a blade, and spat a single word that would echo through my bones. Bastard. It should have destroyed me. That was his intention, but instead it built me. It carved me into someone who could look at pain and turn it into power. I think about him sometimes in fragments. A slam of a door, the weight of silence at the dinner table, the shame in his eyes whenever he looked at me. He never gave me love, but he gave me something else. Resolve. A cruel gift, but one I learned to use. Richard Whitmore believed names carried weight. His name opened doors, silenced opposition, commanded respect. He thought mine was worthless, a stain he couldn't wash away. Yet, in the end, it was my name, Charlotte Whitmore, that carried him to his downfall. He called me a bastard. But in the end, I was the one who bore his name into power, and I was the one who erased him. That truth chills me sometimes. To destroy your enemy is one thing. To destroy your father is another. But then, was he ever really my father? Or just a man who happened to share his blood with me, who spent my life reminding me I wasn't worthy of it? People ask if revenge heals. I won't lie to you, it doesn't. The wounds remain, scars etched deep where no one else can see. But revenge, it reclaims. It takes what was stolen. It returns the voice they tried to silence, the dignity they stripped away, the pride they shattered in public. When I fired him, when I saw the shock flicker across his face, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt balanced. He humiliated me before the world, and I humiliated him before the only thing he ever worshipped: power. The story ends the way it began, with silence. He disappeared, bankrupt and forgotten. I remained stronger and unbroken. He left me nothing but his name, and I turned that name into something greater than he ever could. If you're reading this, if you followed me through every shadow of my past, then you know this truth. We are not defined by the people who try to break us. We are defined by how we rise when they do. Richard Whitmore is gone. Charlotte Whitmore remains. And in the quiet aftermath of it all, I finally understand. This was never just his story. It was mine, and mine will live on.